All right, guys, we're back with the second part of the notes on the history of psychology. Today, or this video is going to be focusing on the kind of final two perspectives that are highlighted in the book, and then also talking about evaluating the perspectives, maybe looking at a scenario from each of them. And then finally, we'll talk about like what are psychologists doing in the field today, and how do jobs in psychology, kind of look. Your book goes into a lot of detail about that, so I'm going to kind of let that do the heavy lifting for a lot of this. But we are going to kind of get into um, the a little bit of the breakdown of what the jobs are and how that works. So, if you remember last video, we were talking about, you know, the first kind of major field that's still with us today is the psychodynamic field that was started by Freud. That was immediately followed by the behaviorists. Remember, Freud was focused on unconscious thoughts in the mind, and then the behaviorists were all entirely focused on no mind at all, just how the behavior is working. So that leads to another backlash, which I alluded to last time, where behavior becomes less important than the way that we think about things. So in the 1950s, following the works of a guy on the screen there, Jean Piaget, they started challenging behavior and the behaviorists, basically saying that humans are more complex than just basically machines that respond to incentives. Humans make decisions and choices and have faulty logic and don't follow normal rules of behavior. Um, and that led to what is essentially known as the cognitive revolution in psychology. And that was really started in the 50s because they started coming up with new ways to measure internal processes. Um, right. And cognitive psych comes from cognition, right, which is like thinking. So cognitive psychology studies things like how do we think, like how does our memory work, how when we think about something, like where is that taking place in the brain, um, and also things with language, um, and how we process that information, right? So cognitive psychologists might study people with learning differences or something to learn how they process information. And the two big names here are Jean Piaget and Noam Chomsky. Chomsky was a linguist, actually born in Philly. He's still alive today, works in MIT. Um, but both of them are really credited with creating this new perspective in cognition for psychology to focus on the way that we think about things mattering. Um, we'll talk more about that later, a little bit later this year, but basically, like how you think about a scenario really determines how you act in that scenario, right? Is it something that you're responding to with fear or with joy? Are you excited or are you terrified? And those are cognitive labels that we put on emotions. So it dictates our experiences and our behavior. So cognition and the cognitive perspective are still with us today, and they're still very prevalent um, in today's psychology. Uh, that also led to the humanistic perspective. So these two guys are Abraham Maslow at the top and Carl Rogers at the bottom. They are similar to cognitive psychologists and came out in the 60s, um, challenging the mainstay of the behaviorists like Skinner before them. But they were focused more on like human flourishing, which is a very vague word. So basically, a lot of it was trying to live up to people's potential, to free the person from whatever issues they're dealing with or shackles that they're dealing with, but actually, being able to focus on, uh, what is needed to make them be successful and whatever that means in life. So humanistic psychology it's tough because a lot of guys confuse it with cognitive psych, but it's more about like achieving one's potential. Um, that the way that we talk to ourselves, right? Our self-image, our self-talk, our self-image. Did I say self-image already? Um, self-concept, our self-esteem. Like all of these things are important for humanistic psychology to understand what is needed for success. Um, in a therapy setting, Rogers really started the idea that clients, people who are coming in, should be treated as human beings, right? They're not illnesses or there's not anything wrong with them, that they should be treated with respect and treated as just like someone who's dealing with an issue um, today. A lot of kind of talk therapy, not the like lay on the couch and tell me about your dreams, but the like, hey, how are you doing? Like, what is there anything you need to talk about or talk through? A lot of that is coming from the humanistic perspective. Um, Nowadays, humanistic psychology is not really around as much anymore. A lot of that has been replaced with what's called positive psychology. Positive psychology is basically the same idea that we should be looking at human strengths and what we do well instead of always focusing on like the issues that we have and the mistakes we make and those kinds of things. But the difference is that the positive psychology movement actually does experiments and tests things to make sure, like, what does it mean to live a good life, and um, what actually is happiness, and how can we study that and measure it, and create an experiment that we can actually get results and understand, like, hey, if you do these three things, it will make you happier. Whereas humanistic psychology is more just about, like, I say this kind of lovingly, but it's a little bit more like hippy dippy, like, oh, come on, man, everybody's equal, we're all good, let's just talk about our issues, right? Remember, this came out in the 60s, so it kind of tracks. Psychology doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's affected by the culture that's around us. So those are kind of the main perspectives. There's obviously some other ones that we're not really talking about here. I alluded to evolutionary psych last time. That comes up a lot. We'll talk about biological perspective, like how does everything that we're talking about like live in the brain. And that actually is a good tie into the next thing that psychology has been dealing with really from the beginning as well, and that's the debate over nature or nurture. So basically, what this is saying is our life, whether it's our thoughts, actions, desires, um, life outcomes, are they determined by birth, by your genetic makeup, or are they determined by your environment? The not maybe also kind of by birth, but by the environment that you grew up in. And there's been plenty of debate back and forth. So if we go back originally to the guy who thought of this is Darwin, right? Um, with natural selection, which some people claim is like the best idea anyone has ever had, ever. Um, Darwin came up with the theory that organisms have random genetic mutations that happen by accident during when the genes are split. Um, those mutations can either be benign, where they don't mean anything. They can be essentially bad, which can cause early death of the organism or something, or they can be beneficial. Um, and the thought process is that over time, the ones that are beneficial, that allow for that organism to survive to adulthood, to reproduce, um, those are going to be more likely to be passed on to their offspring. And if you play that out over, thousands and thousands of years, you're going to have different species of animals be created out of that, adapting to the environment. Um, Darwin did a really, his stuff was most, everyone knows about the turtles and the Galapagos, but it was actually a lot of his work with birds and seeing a bird that was pretty much identical on two different islands, but had just different shaped beaks. And that was because of the uh, different types of trees that were there. So one of the um, one of the birds had like a narrow, thin beak, and that was because the trees on that island produced like pine cone like things. So they were able to, pry open the pine cone and get the seeds out from inside. And on the other tree, on the other island, the trees were mostly like walnuts, so that they had to be like the seeds had to be like cracked. So that bird developed like a shorter thicker beak that was able to crack open the shells of the seeds and eat them. And Darwin was able to figure all that out, just basically through observation. But it led to this idea that originally those birds were the same bird. It was birds that came to the island, but as they stayed, those that had stronger beaks thrived on the island with the thicker seeds, and those with narrower beaks thrived on the island with the pine cones. And it just kind of kept over thousands of years and hundreds of generations. It eventually adapted to their environment. So that's what we mean when we talk about natural selection or evolution. It's that process, which really leads to the question: is, are all traits determined? Is everything that we have, whether it's our personality traits, our preferences, or the things that we do or find interesting, are those biologically determined, right? You look at families where it's like there's mechanics in the family, and for generations it's just mechanics and mechanics and mechanics, or doctors or lawyers or whatever. Is that a biological thing? Are people prone to certain interests because of their biology, because of the genetic information that they inherited from their parents? And at the same time, right, we also, I think, intuitively know that our experiences shape our behaviors. We're not just copies of our parents. We have our own internal lives. We have our own interests. Some of you probably like, maybe different sports teams or different types of food than maybe your parents do. Maybe you have different political beliefs than your parents, right? So our lived experience shapes who we are as well. We know that to be true. So these are some really deep questions. And from the psychological perspective, right? These are interesting questions from philosophy. We could talk about this stuff all day, but from psychology, how do we test this, right? How do we develop an experiment that determines something, whether the effect is nature or nurture, right? If this is a science, we need to come up with a way to test and to make sense of this. So that's where psychology comes in and tries to think of unique ways that we can pry this apart. And I'll leave some of the spoilers for a later unit, but I will say that twins are involved. That's what I'll say. But either way, whether it's experience shaping our behavior or our genes shaping our behavior, it also kind of leads to a question that I brought up with Skinner, and that's, do we actually have free will? Or is a lot of what we do predetermined, right? If all of our traits are based off of our genetic code, then where does free will come in? If all of our desires are shaped by our experience, where does free will come in there? So psychology deals with this a lot, and I'm happy to talk more about free will. I find this concept very interesting. I studied it in philosophy, and I've read some psychological works that go into it, but it's not a huge component of the class, so we'll just leave it there. And if we want to have conversations around it, I'm very happy to. But let's just say that if it's not a thing, then it has really major implications for just about every aspect of our lives, which is why I think it's interesting to talk about. So, all right, so let's cut to the chase. What does psychology say about nature versus nurture? Is it genetics or is it the environment? And as we'll see, which is kind of a theme, which will be an emerging theme for this course, it's both. So the way that we understand nature and nurture is that nature predisposes. So nature, your genetic code, predisposes you to be, say, a certain height. Based off of your parents' genetic code, you are born with a range that you could, as the height that you could be when you're fully grown. But nurture activates that predisposition. So depending on things like your nutrition level, your access to, high quality food, whether or not you're doing things like smoking or other things that stunt your growth, right? We hear that phrase, stunt your growth. That means that our environment has an impact on things that would normally be considered genetic. So, that's why you can be taller than your parents, right? It's because maybe you had better nutrition, you inherited, the taller genes, and with your better nutrition, that allows you to be taller than your parents. Maybe you're shorter than your parents, right? Same thing. Maybe you inherited shorter genes, but you had great nutrition, or maybe not the best nutrition, or maybe you engaged in risky behavior when you were still growing, and that led to a, a slowdown in your growth, right? So what psychology seems to be finding is that a lot of things are this, that nature gives you kind of like a range, and then your environment, your lived experience, narrows down what you're actually going to end up with. We see that with intelligence and IQ scores. We see that with personality traits. We see that with just about everything that you can think of from a psychological perspective, from a who you are as a person perspective. That you have a predisposition. Same thing with diseases. So genetically, I'll share this. I have a predisposition towards celiac disease, a gluten intolerance. I'm not celiac. I don't have a gluten intolerance, but my genetics say that I could. There's a history of diabetes in my family. So I'm predisposed by my genetic code, to diabetes. But it depends on how my behavior is, that it can either activate that predisposition. I can either turn on, hey, all right, we're sorry, you got diabetes now, or not, right? Depending on my actions in life. So that's kind of how this works. If you have questions here, let me know. But that's kind of how the whole nature nurture work thing works. The other thing that perspective I guess I should bring up is something that your book goes into. This is David Myers's like personal uh, thing in psychology, and that is something called biopsychosocial. You'll see that over and over and over again. That if we're really trying to understand behavior or mental processes, we have to look at it from three different ranges. One is the biological component, right? What is the brain chemistry that's happening to allow certain things? What is the genetic predispositions or the inheritance that you're getting from your parents? Psychological perspectives. What are the things that you're learning and making sense of in your own head? What are your fears? What are your emotions? Right. Those are the kind of psychological components. And then finally, what is the social components? Right. What is your outside environment doing? So it's both like your inborn, your innate, and then your external components really combine to give a full sense of a behavior or a way of thinking. Um, your book is going to go into that a ton because, like I said, David Myers kind of approaches things from that perspective. And it's a good perspective to have because it keeps reminding us of the different perspectives that are out there. But, keep that in mind, biopsychosocial. All right, so here's just some charts. I think this is similar to something that's in your book now. I'm not going to spend too much time going through this, right? Neuroscience, we didn't talk too much about that. It's basically the brain's biology. And how those create everything. So the thing that trips me up is everything that you experience is neurons firing in your brain. Every thought you have, every emotion you feel, every word you speak, every word that you learn in vocab is just a series of neural connections in your mind or in your brain that creates your mind. That's crazy. Like that really like messes with my head if I think about it too much. But neuroscience studies those things. We talked about evolutionary psychology. Behavior genetics talks about that play between nature and nurture, right? To what extent are things like sexual orientation, genetic or environmental? Psychodynamic, behavioral, we already went over those. Same thing with cognitive. Sociocultural talks about how do we learn things from our culture or from other people. So how do we integrate these perspectives? So let's try to think about something like aggression, right? Most psychologists and most just whether researchers or clinicians, therapists, or other types of psychologists, oh man, I'm struggling now, are going to try to look at things from multiple different perspectives to try to explain things, right? Psychology realizes that it's not great to be siloed at all times, right? Just to only be focused in your one, but there's levels of expertise and interest that kind of drives a lot of this. So let's look at something like aggression, right? So you got a bully here pushing a kid up against a locker, something that obviously never happens here at Holy Ghost. And what happens? How do we explain that from the different perspectives, right? So let's start with the biological perspective. A biological psychologist is going to say that aggression happens because of low levels of serotonin, right, which is a neurotransmitter that boosts mood. You get a rush of serotonin if you go for a runner. If you're a runner's high is based off of serotonin. Boosts mood. It helps with clearing depression, right? And aggression is associated with low levels of serotonin. So that's an explanation from biological psychology. Evolutionary psychology is going to look at things that maybe we act aggressive if someone challenges our status, right? Think about from an evolutionary perspective that if someone is a threat to you, you need to act on that to make sure that they don't take what's yours, right? That's an evolutionary perspective here. Cognitive psychologists are going to look at this, that hey, maybe things are rewarded. We see the success of someone else bullying someone and getting the lunch money. So then maybe you think, oh man, maybe I can do the same thing, right? Maybe you see that association, you make those connections cognitively. Social psychologists are going to look at how aggression plays in groups, and how we are likely to be more aggressive if we're anonymous. Think of YouTube comments, right? If you're hiding behind a screen name that isn't tied to you, people tend to be nasty. Or think about people rioting after a sports victory, right? If you're unaccountable, if there's no way that if you feel like you can't be held accountable for your actions, then maybe you act a little bit more aggressively. And we know that's true from social psych. Developmental psychology is going to look at how aggression changes throughout the lifespan, and they'll say something like, aggression tends to die down, and especially in males by the time they hit their mid-20s. So, they're looking at something from across the lifespan, from womb to tomb, as they like to say. Clinical psych, so these are like therapists, are going to look at people who have impulse control and try to help coach them to be more in control of their desires and impulses, right? We all get angry sometimes, but not all of us act on it. And then personality psychologists are going to look at things like how self-esteem and how you view yourself and your personality traits and how they're impacted with things like aggression. People who are bullies tend to have very high self-esteem, actually. So that's kind of one of the things that we'll be trying to do throughout this early unit here in psychology, is to talk about how the different perspectives would address a problem. We're going to do some things like that in class next week when we talk about this. But it's part of understanding psychology as a whole. Speaking of understanding psychology as a whole, what are the professional specialties, right? How is this broken down in terms of, if you're a psychologist, what are you likely to be doing? So here's a pie chart. As you can see, the vast majority of psychologists are clinical psychologists. That means that they are seeing patients. They are addressing mental disorders. They are, that kind of a psychologist, right? So the vast majority, over 70%, are almost 3/4 are clinical psychologists. If you add in counseling psychologists, so these are people who might not be able to diagnose, but they also talk people through their problems, right? This could be like a social worker or someone that has a degree that is able to provide therapy and advice. Those could be counseling psychologists. There's differences between clinical psych and counseling psych that you're going to need to know. Your book does a pretty good job of differentiating the two, and I have some tips that we'll talk about in class and some videos I can share that really hammer that down. There's also a bunch of IO psychologists. These are people who focus on things like human resources in companies, or how to make people more effective at their jobs. IO psych is really interesting if you kind of get into it. Same thing with human factor psychology. How do humans interact with their natural world and their artificial world? So one of the things from human factor psych that I always think about is, why does a car have a steering wheel and not a joystick, right? It seems kind of obvious to us, but someone had to make that decision, right? And wheels are easier for us to understand the movement of than joysticks are. But that's just one example. I have a bunch of others that'll come up throughout the year. School psychologist is someone who deals with adolescents and maybe learning differences. but also the issues that are going on in the school age population. So, for example, Dr. Pollack is actually a clinical psychologist by training, but in his role at Holy Ghost, he's a school psychologist. Um, Clinical neuropsychology. Why was I struggling with that word? That's more like brain chemistry and those kinds of things. Forensic psychology is actually not all that common. It's what everybody wants to do because of shows like CSI and SVU and all that stuff. But in reality, forensic psychology is not that common, despite it being pretty strong in our media. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about with you guys is just some overall themes in psychology. Um, Psychology as a field is empirical. What that means is it's based in science. Psychology is not a field that deals with thoughts or ideas. They're going to say, show me the data, show me the proof, show me the experiments that back up what you're saying. So critical thinking, which is something we've talked about in class already, is fundamentally important here when it comes to psychology and understanding our behavior. Because otherwise, it's just philosophy. Nothing wrong with philosophy, but it's not psychology. It's theoretically diverse. There's dozens of different perspectives, which I'm sure you're getting a little bit like, oh my gosh, there's so much here. But think about what that means as the field. There's so many different people that are looking at things from different perspectives, which is awesome. We also know that psychology evolves in a socio-historical context. It's a fun word. Basically, it's saying is as society changes, so does psychology, right? Think of the humanistic perspective coming to fruition in the 1960s, right? That kind of just makes sense. That everything kind of evolves together. We know that behavior is both determined by multiple causes and our own culture. What is acceptable in some cultures is unacceptable in others. Quick story: when we were in the Middle East in Qatar, for when I was going to Tanzania, we had a layover there, and one of the things that I had to learn was that showing someone the bottom of your foot is a sign of high disrespect. So like sitting with your legs crossed, like I was sitting at the airport with my legs crossed, and I was getting all of these dirty looks because I was basically giving everybody the middle finger that walked past me, and I had no idea. So what is normal behavior in one culture is not normal in others. Same thing with like eye contact when you're talking to people. Some cultures it's a sign of respect, some cultures it's a sign of disrespect. You just need to be aware of that. We know that there's nature and nurture in our behavior, and we know that our experience of the world is highly subjective. No two people experience the world the same. They have their own internal life, they have their own external environments. Even identical twins have different experiences of the world and their life. So it's important for us to always keep that in mind, right? Just as human beings, we should always understand that people are going through. They might be experiencing something different than what we are, and we should be empathetic and caring towards those individuals, towards everyone. Gentlemen, that's it for the first kind of larger part one unit here for AP Psych. I'm going to log off of this video, and if you have any questions, don't forget to shoot me an email as you watch them, or just come to class prepared with them already written down after watching this video. I will see you guys all soon. Take it easy.